My topic today is risk. In particular, the problem that has arisen as risk management has moved from a private activity to a largely politicized activity. Those of you who know something about the Competitive Enterprise Institute know we're a pro-market public interest group. We play a role somewhat similar to the NATO right groups, the consumerist groups, a little different in ideology, as you might imagine. The NATO right groups, the progressive movement, generally believes that if there's a problem out there, a little more government run by the right people will make everything very, very better. And those of us in the free market movement believe if you have a problem and government gets involved, you've got two problems. A little commercial. We work a lot on risk issues, science policy. We've got the largest environmental group. Arthur occasionally writes about our work and quotes it in his Access to Energy in terms that almost makes me blush. But actually, I think if you read our material, you'll get a much more balanced view of the way the world works, how environmental issues are actually handled. You don't have to be a red to be a green, and I think most of you know that. Although if you read the political papers, you don't get that across very well. We're also doing a lot of work now on science policy. We're trying to take some of the intellectual ideas I think we all understand and translate them into more humanized forms. You know, if we're so smart, why are we losing so many policy battles? And part of it is we've fought with our minds, but we haven't brought our hearts involved. And I think that's a critical failure of intellectuals on our side, not on their side. And we've got to be more intelligent if we're going to prevail in this world. Political management of risk illustrates the things I'm talking about very, very well. You know, this conference was organized, I'd say, 6-8 months ago, and at that time, it would have seemed that any early attempt to reform political risk management in America was a hopeless, quixotic quest. Those of you who have been reading the papers and are active in this area know that America is now involved in an incredible constitutional dialogue with itself to try to determine not what we want as a nation. We want a safer world, we want a fairer world, we want a cleaner world, but how to go about doing it. We're no longer as enamored of the nanny regulator state, and I think the American people are vastly ahead of the politicians, even the Republican politicians in Washington. We have a chance. If you read the papers, of course, the dialogue is between, mad dog ideologues joined with big fat cat robber baron capitalists to put arsenic in the baby's food supply. That's one approach. That's in the papers and the newspaper and television. And then I think the more recent one, which is how do we gain common sense control over a regulatory establishment that is certainly out now. We're going to have I think we'll have time for question and answers after this. I take it I can run over a little bit since the last one did. In the risk reform debate, as in so many politics, logic is for losers. That point is illustrated by a story. Smoking, most of you know, is a serious risk factor, implicated in the deaths of some 500,000 people a year. Most of you know driving is risky. About 50,000 people are involved in automobile-related accidents per year. But I would doubt that many of you in this room are really expert on shark attack risk in the United States. Any shark experts in the room? Well, the numbers are vary, obviously, from year to year, but it's about 1 or 2 deaths a year, a relatively modest risk factor. Yet, not many years ago, if you would go to any beach in America, stand on the dunes and say, "Shark, shark," everybody would run out of the water, light up a cigarette, and drive home. That illustrates, I think, very, very well the risk associated with emotionalizing, sensationalizing risk factors, and nowhere is that clearer than in the political process. Fears motivate people, and politicians understand that very, very well. Ruckelshaus, when he headed up the EPA, he said, fears encourage people or make people willing to give up their freedoms, and I think much of the loss of freedom in America has been promoted by fear-mongering bureaucracies who have grown at our expense. They pander to these fears shamelessly, and I think we are somewhat subject to them, very subject to them. Americans in many ways seem vastly more superstitious, vastly more frightened than their grandparents did. The late Aaron Wildowski, who some of you knew, a wonderful scholar and a tremendous loss to our side, like Peter Beckman, one of the great people trying to carve out a rational approach in an all too irrational world, pointed out that here we are, the safest, healthiest, longest-lived populations in the history of the world, and yet we're terrified of almost everything. Or Wildowski said, "What is an American's fear?" He said, "Not much, really. The air we breathe, the food we eat, the people we're married to, the place we live in, the place we work in, the cars we drive. Other than that, not much at all." Why is that? Doesn't it sound just a little bit crazy? I mean, step back about it and think about it. Risks are always present, but now they're gaining an all too ready audience. When I was a kid, there were people out there who were convinced that there were evil people in our society putting poisonous substance in our water supply for nefarious purposes. And there still are. But when I was a kid, the villains were the communists, the substance was fluoride, or fluorine, and the charges were brought by the John Birch Society. Today the same fears exist, but the villains are big businesses, and technologists, of course. The substances are toxic chemicals, electromagnetic fields, and anything associated with radiation, and the charges are brought by the environmental establishment. But the biggest difference, and I think you're all aware of this, is when we were kids, nobody took those charges very seriously, and today everyone does. Certainly our vice president does. Those of you who have read Al Airhead Gore have some idea about what this man believes. If you've read his statements, if you've read Earth in the Balance, and you've read The Unabomber, you worry. The efforts to legislate away risk has resulted in America increasingly bound up in an incredible array of intrusive regulations. The CPSC, Consumer Safety Product Commission, the Environmental Protection Administration, the Federal Trade Commission, the OSHA, the Office of Safety and Health Administration, MMSHA. There's a whole alphabet soup of organizations that are dedicated to making sure that you and I don't make fools of ourselves. After all, get between a fool and their mistake and you'll have more fools, and that seems to be the purpose of government policy. Increasingly, any product or technology must gain an array of approvals by bureaucrats before it is allowed to be tried out by the American people. Think about that. Limiting the rate of innovation in our society to the entrepreneurial brilliance of the bureaucracy, and you get a flavor of why America's productivity is in such trouble today. America's search for the safety, the risk-free society has moved us vastly towards an anti-regulatory state described by Alex de Tocqueville in his prophetic Democracy in America. Let me just quote something that this man, remember, is writing in 1820 about an America that he has observed for 1 year. He's a Frenchman, and he gets it right almost down to the penny. His fears about America is not that we would become a dictatorship or that we would go in various other ways crazy, but that we would create a new form of despotism, a despotism of safety and kindness, in a quote. A state in which men are seldom forced to act, but they are constantly refrained from acting. A state that does not tyrannize, but it compresses, innervates, extinguishes, and stultifies a people till they are reduced to nothing more than a flock of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. Now that describes the goal of an awful lot of people in the regulatory establishment, and it's grown very much. For too many Americans, the regulatory burden is already greater than the income tax burden in the United States. One of the real dangerous consequences of this massive expansion has been an almost complete transformation of public expectations regarding risk, regarding the chances that something will go wrong in our life. Once we expected private parties, you and I, when we dealt with others, to mitigate the effects of unfortunate events, not to prevent their occurrence. Not so with the new government risk regulators. The leaders of these agencies seem willing to pledge themselves to making the world risk-free. The head of the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, recently pledged himself to produce an airline industry in which no planes crashed. I don't know what we're going to do about gravity, but God knows it's got to go. We're going to cause problems out there. A world free from chemicals. Have you talked to any of your brother-in-laws or sister-in-laws? Don't you think the world would be safer without chemicals? I think so, yes. A pharmaceutical system that will never again encounter a thalidomide event. In response, many Americans have demanded that, and politicians have done it. And we have a set of laws out there that are designed to ensure that nothing goes wrong on those books that the regulators are responsible for. Enact a few more laws, design and implement a handful of regulations, enforce them vigorously, and the world at last will be safe. The result is a tragic variant of Gresham's Law. Utopian but horribly flawed political regulatory schemes drive out more realistic private schemes that offer real hopes, not of a safe world, but of a vastly safer world. Let me discuss in the rest of my remarks how this is going about in practice and what we can begin to do about it. Some examples. In the real world, there are risks and there are risks. Chlorinated water, in the way EPA goes about measuring risk, and most of you are familiar with the human as a little mouse who eats a lot of funny things. A risk that is small in comparison, but chlorination under that scheme has a risk. A small risk in comparison to contaminated water. I mean, worrying about, parts per billion of chlorinated products in your water when most of the world is worried about billions per part of bacteria in their water is a strange thing, but America, as you know, is on this quest that makes little sense. We have to look at the risk of chlorinating water versus the risk of drinking contaminated water. There are risks that technology introduces, but there are risks of living in a world without technology. Let me talk about that. A recent court decision made that very clear in a common hazard that some of you may have encountered last night, not sex. It's another risk. This is a small risk, like most of the risk in our lives. Most of you probably can't even see the risk I'm holding in my hand, yet it's a product that history tells us has killed, and killed repeatedly. The device is a toothpick.
Careful.
This is a killer toothpick. Now, I didn't characterize it that way. That's the way it was characterized in a court decision commenting on an EPA decision about asbestos products. EPA, of course, didn't try to say this. The court did. EPA was after asbestos, a product that sounds, at least to the uninformed, a lot more dangerous than toothpicks. EPA was seeking to ban asbestos-containing shingles and pipes. Now, certain types of asbestos at certain exposure levels, especially if you smoke, can indeed have serious health effects. However, asbestos at the risk exposures that EPA was talking about had very, very small risk, estimated risk. Judge Breyer, then a federal district judge, and now, as many of you know, a Supreme Court justice, in a book called Breaking the Vicious Circle, analyzed this case. He noted that EPA's own analysis suggested that banning these asbestos-based products might save about 7 lives per year. Now, the way this is done is statistical, hypothetical lives. Nobody's ever going to know whether this is true or not, but EPA carries these, what we used to call, when I was a young analyst, zonking analysis, zonking, scientification of non-knowledge. It's a game that you play in government to appear quantitative when you don't know what the hell you're doing. Nobody could ever find this out. 7 lives out of the millions of people who are actually dying every year. But in contrast, toothpicks kill real people. You know that poor Uncle Joe, he didn't get it out of his mouth in time and he choked to death. It's tragic, it's unusual, we don't worry about it very much. But toothpicks actually kill real people, not statistical, not hypothetical people. Breyer noticed that and said, toothpicks are twice as risky as asbestos products, and you want to regulate them? This is crazy. He made the toothpick standard a legal standard, and by that standard, EPA was over-regulating, and he overturned it. Yet if EPA were regulating toothpicks, and believe me, there are organizations out there, the CPSC, that might do it someday, EPA might well ban it. They cause some deaths. If they didn't have toothpicks out there, then toothpicks wouldn't be causing you to die. You'd be probably using sticks and other things to clean your teeth with. But they wouldn't be approved products, and therefore their hands would be clean. Risk regulation agencies have been given a morally and an intellectually easy, almost trivial task. They wear the white hats. They are the white hat champions of safety. They seek a less risky world, safer products, a cleaner environment. Now, their actions may in fact entail cost. There may be economic consequences, they concede that. And there are those people out in this miserly, green eye-shadowed world of businessmen and Republican accountants that may wish to put a price tag on human life, assign a dollar value to the destruction of one of God's unique ecosystems. And these people have political power, and sometimes their selfish, narrow values prevail against my desire for safety, to save human life. Well, that's the world, but we wear the white hat. In a world that is both wealthy and moralistic and idealistic, the regulators almost always win. When things are when the world is rich, the regulators win today. When the economy is really doing badly, we defer the regulations until there's an upturn, and then the regulatory bloodletting recommences. In effect, we always have one answer. We're either not regulating enough or we're not regulating soon enough, because after all, it's money on one side and life's on the other. EPA's attempt to ban a product twice as safe as toothpicks had a happy ending. The agency was overturned. But a very large number of EPA regulatory sagas do not have such a happy ending. EPA's regulation of plant pesticides, of radon, of dioxin, of lead, and a host lead poisoning, a major problem in inner city America. Absolutely true, but it's not coming out of the mouths of paint cans, it's coming out of the mouth of guns. These people basically don't get it. They do this because EPA has no reason and no responsibility, and neither the other regulatory agencies, to consider the consequences of their action. There is no concept of overregulation. Agencies are free to pursue their own goals, not to the bitter end, because there really is no ending in this process. If the obsessions go on and on and on, reduce the risk of some substances to parts per million, and immediately someone out there will say, what about parts per billion? What about risk to small children who have dietary deficiencies, or small children whose parents are masochists and send them out in the backyard to eat dirt every day? I mean, sooner or later you'll find some hypothetical case in which a little more regulation will make the world a little safer. If mice pass all the health tests, then try hamsters or aardvarks. There must be some species out there that will cause problems. Oral intake creates no problem, mainstreaming into the bloodstream. Under the better safe than sorry standard, under what I think Sally talked to you about yesterday, the precautionary principle, any risk is a reason to regulate. There are no stopping rules in the modern regulatory state. Think about it. There isn't a medicine in your cabinet that doesn't have some risk, and yet medicines cure disease. Most of the cleaning supplies under your sink, if in a dump, would be a hazardous waste site, but under your sink they allow you to keep a cleaner home. The Industrial Revolution spawned a multitude of machines that could kill or maim innocent individuals, operators, exploding steam boilers on boats, malfunctioning factory equipment. Yet the major improvements in productivity that were made possible by these massive outpourings of the Industrial Revolution exposed fewer workers to these hazardous conditions and has made the world vastly safer. The steam engine, anyway, there's also the displacement effect. Steam engines are dangerous, but remember, steam engines and other motive power technologies allowed us to replace other technologies, earlier technologies, a horse, for example, who was, in its own way, a very, very dangerous item. If any of you tried to insure a horse lately, it comes up well up there with sports car levels. Horses and other things were technologies that had their own risk, and by moving to modern technologies, we've actually made the world very safer. The world is made safer by dangerous products and processes. It is a good idea to let unsafe products be utilized. Unsafe products that are safer than the products they replace. The world is made safer by greater wealth. A wealthier, more technologically progressive society is more resilient and can ride out whatever adversities are created. Nature creates storm risk in many parts of the world. There are storms in the United States, there are storms in Bangladesh. In America, very few people die when hurricanes rip across our landscape. In Bangladesh, tens of thousands of people die. It is not that nature is more benevolent to the United States than it is to Bangladesh. It is that our society has the mobility, the wealth, the resiliency, the interconnectivity that allows us to quickly adapt and to respond to the kind of crises that nature deals out. Nature hasn't changed. Man's ability, because of our own freedom, has made it possible to do more. A free society is the greatest course we have to a safer society. And for that reason, the greatest risk of all is stagnation, the slowing down, the stopping of new products and technologies. We should, and we do, consider the risk of new technologies. When you open new doors, when you try new things out, we don't know everything, and sometimes things go wrong, sometimes terribly wrong. We should consider the risk of technological change, but we should also consider the risk of economic and technological stagnation. Our challenge as a society is to balance the risk of change and the risk of stasis. At CI, we are promoting this more balanced viewpoint. We refer to this project in one area as death by regulation, the area in which the regulations themselves create more risk than they reduce. We are hoping that this product, this educational process as it is, will begin to make it possible to have people, the American people, to have as much skepticism about the enlightened brilliance of their political regulators as they have about their businessmen. They're skeptical if a businessman says, trust me. They haven't been as skeptical as we think they should when a government official steps forward and says, trust me. Or maybe that was my bias inside Washington. The election of '94 suggests that the American people are all too ready to accept the realistic appraisal of their government. They don't think these people are trustworthy, and they threw a lot of them out. Not enough, but next election we can get rid of the rest of them. Let me give you a few examples we're working on. Airline child seats. Some of you have children. Some of you may have. Did any of you fly here with your children? Nobody? When you fly now, you know, there was a big ruling. There was a crash in Iowa a few years ago where a plane went down. It was one of those rare crashes. Generally, either everybody dies or nobody dies. This was one of those situations where the pilot made an incredible, brilliant landing, but the crash was still sufficient to kill about half the flight. One of the people killed was a young baby who was thrown from her mother's arms. Another mother on the flight had her baby thrown from her arms, but fortunately that baby survived. That mother formed an organization with Nader to basically demand that on all future flights, children have their own seats, their own safety seats. The argument seemed to be quite clear. A child in a safety seat in an airplane is safer than a child in the mother's arms in an airplane. That's true. Then why not mandate a safer world? Well, we and others looked at the issue and said, well, what happens if you mandate that a parent will have that special seat for that special child? Airlines are going to charge for that seat, or they're going to raise the prices on all seats so that the cost is covered. And that means that the cost of airline travel will go up a little bit. Who are most affected by higher prices? Not the wealthy people whose children are grown up, the young parents who've saved enough to go see grandma for the Thanksgiving weekend and so on. Those are the parents who are most likely to be deferred from traveling on airplanes if prices go up. Some of them will stay at home and call grandma instead, but some of them will jump in the car, strap baby into the safety seat, and drive to grandmother's. The driving is about 10 times more dangerous than the airplane will be, and so for every child you save in the air, you're condemning some 10 children to die on the ground. Now, of course, that doesn't bother the FAA. That's on somebody else. That's the Federal Highway Administration's responsibility. But it should bother people who recognize that we live in a world where risk of one kind quickly merge over into risk of another type. We argued that point, and I think we prevailed. Sam Kasman, who heads up our Death by Regulation project, was on television. Television, as you may know, is not our media. Logic is not good on television. You have to find emotional ways of addressing the issue. Sam was going to be on against the mother I told you about, who had this very emotional, jarring experience that most of us would feel extreme sympathy for. And Sam said, well, what are you going to do? Well, we're just going to have an intellectual discussion between you two. You're not going to show footages of the airplane crash. Oh, no, we would never do that, they said. So Sam comes on, they show the pictures of the airplane crash, and now, Sam, why are you opposed to safety? You know, this is the way. Sam said, and I think he's one of our better stylists in this, rhetoricians, he said, what happened in Iowa was a tragedy. If this regulation is enacted, it will be an even greater tragedy because, and then quickly nuanced into the argument that when we raise prices, we discourage safe forms of transportation in form of less safe. And within a few minutes, who was Jane Pauley, I think it was, basically was saying, oh, well then you're saying regulations can actually make the world less safe. And I said, oh my God, they're getting it, they're getting it. You worry when they're getting it. We've also worked on corporate average fuel economy. Some of you have read about our work in that area, the regulations that mandate that cars use less energy. Those of you who are physicists realize that one of the ways you use less energy in moving bodies through space is by making them less massive. Smaller cars are one of the results of the CAFE standards, and all things equal, a safe small car is not as safe as a safe large car. If you hit a tree, it is better to be in an M1 tank than in a Hyundai. This is not rocket science logic. This is fairly sensible, and the organization responsible for this regulation, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, has spent 15 years denying the simple logic of that statement, because if they admit it, then my God, they've got blood on their hands. And of course they do. They're killing thousands of people every year because of their refusal to allow Americans and American producers to make the safer cars at lower energy prices and a greater, wealthier society would allow us to buy. The area, though, I think that has had the most implication in this is the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA, in its own way, has a drug policy. You heard Peter talk about a drug policy. Well, in America today, we do have a drug policy. It's a just say no drug policy, but of course it applies to health-enhancing drugs, not to recreational drugs. In America today, the FDA has a policy that says it's new, it's unsure, you can't use it. This means that we slow down and often block the use of technologies that have been used, in some cases, for 10 years in Europe. Some of you as doctors, and you know there are ways around this, but those ways are cumbersome. It's difficult to inform the average doctor of these because of prohibitions on advertising. The general view is until the FDA decides what you can do, doctors' hands are somewhat tied in this world. How do we explain that to people? Because the FDA is supposed to make the world safer. It's addressing the thalidomide problem, and everyone in America has seen the pictures of the tragic thalidomide babies, the deformities produced by that tetragenic substance introduced in a way that was not intended for that purpose. How do we show the victims of the world the safer world that could be? These are statistical people. What are the names of the people who would be saved by the faster introduction of beta blockers? How do we make people understand this? Well, one thing we've been doing is, of course, doing a lot of research. We've written papers, we've testified, we've engaging in coalition building, but we're also trying to go out to mass culture, to educating the American public on this. And one thing we have is a series of ads we've developed, and I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to play the... We honed our message down. There's a lot of intellectual messages in this area, and what we tried to do was to take an intellectual message and compress it to a soundbite, to a provocative soundbite. And then we're going to see whether it works or not. My staff always tells me technology works. Well, you see what happens when you try this. Let me tell you what the ad says. Oh, what's the speed? Let's stop and I'll give it to him soon. Yeah. What that ad said, if you would have heard it on WGMS radio in Washington and a number of other cities, it's an ad that does the following. It starts out with a stormy scene, a splash, a help, help, and a man going, wait a minute, I've got a rope, I'll save you. Wait a minute, where are you going with that rope? The ominous voice of the bureaucrat says. But there's a man drowning. We've got to save him. Can't help that. Where is the paperwork? But, let me see the paperwork. You're not going to do anything until we know that product, that rope is safe. And so, all right, and he gives them the paperwork, and the guy says, no, very good, and the help is going down the background. And he finally says, all right, very good, the paperwork checks out well, there's no fraying on this rope, very good, I think you've done a good job. Ahoy out there, the rope we're about to throw you meets all federal safety regulations. Ahoy, ahoy. And then a voiceover saying, think about this, in government delay, in the area of safety, government caution can be deadly. If a technology will start saving lives tomorrow, how many people died yesterday waiting for government to act? We took that was a 60-second message. We took the same thing in television, and we tried it in a different way, because television is even more emotional. You have to actually paint your pictures in real symbols. There we used an FDA Kessler lookalike. All of you know that swarmy little worm, Kessler, basically sitting up there, and we got a person who looked just like him, and he was at an FDA podium, and it was a press conference, and he was sitting up there strutting as he does, and he said, and today my agency, and in the audience there were all the reporters taking notes, snapping pictures, television cameras rolling, announces the approval of a new drug that my agency thinks will save 8,000 lives next year. And all the reporters get up and start applauding. And the voice, then the sound changes, and an ominous sound occurs. And as you're panning over the applauding reporters, the voice says, if a new drug will save 8,000 lives next year, we're using beta blocker, I think, as our indicator, 8,000 lives next year, and then the panning stops on the crowd and now shows the cemeteries. It pans back across the cemetery. How many people died last year waiting for the bureaucrats to act? Shouldn't we know the answer to that before we start applauding, and then it freezes on a pans in midair applauding, and then right to us? Those are the visual images that we think have a chance. Americans aren't stupid. They've just been told one side of the story over and over and over again, and we now believe we're getting a chance to break through on this. That ad was, television's very expensive. The ad cost $12,000. It cost us $20,000 to put it on television. We're a small organization. That's a big chunk of change for us. But our hope was that it would be a Harry and Louise story. By putting it on something like that, we could bounce it into the larger media, and it worked. That ad became the centerpiece of the risk reform stories of ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, and CNBC. We had a home run in every one because they had their talking heads, the Tom DeLays, the Newt Gingriches, the Henry Waxmans of the world, and then this visual image. And the American people saw over and over again, if something will save lives tomorrow, how many died yesterday waiting for government to act? And I think that way of framing the issue gives America a lot to say about. There's a lot to say about the risk reform debate in Congress. We're right in the middle of it. Things are going not as well as they should. We've not done a brilliant job of marketing that idea. The business community does not know how to make moral intellectual arguments. Our newer politicians don't really know how to use the hearing process and the political process to tutorialize, to educate. They know how to win political victories. They don't know how to translate those into moral and intellectual victories. And in our society, you've got to do both or you have no prevailing victories. But I think that's a learning curve, and we're well along that. And I'm optimistic that things are going to be better there. We can talk about that in the question and answer. But I began my talk with sharks and toothpicks. Let me end it on a loftier level. The lessons we might learn from the Greek myths of technological change. Many of you will know the story of Prometheus, the god of technology, and his efforts to bring fire to mankind. If you recall the story, the political authorities of the day, Zeus and the fellow gods, opposed that action, arguing that mankind was an uninformed risk-taker. Indeed, pretty evident, right? Uninformed risk-taker. He was an illiterate cave dweller. I mean, how could man adopt the risk of this incredibly new and almost unknown technology? Prometheus, you recall, prevailed, introduced fire to mankind, and was punished severely for his act of entrepreneurial courage. But the gods certainly had some arguments on their side. Fire was unknown, man was relatively uninformed, it was risky, we hadn't done 10 years of blind testing of fire, homes with fires and homes without. And in fact, as many of you know, and to this day, fire is one of the most risky things in your homes. Fires kill many, many people in America today, almost any other form of household risk. But Prometheus knew, as I think most of us know, that, Jeremy Rifkin aside, that for all the risk of fire, man faced other risk as well. The risk of exposure to the elements, the risk of wild animal attacks, the risk of starvation, because what fire did, among other things, was allow man to better preserve food, smoking, drying of foods, and therefore ride out the risks that starvation situations would create. In legend, Prometheus violated the commands of the gods. Today, he'd be violating the commands of the Federal Register. Yet the myth of Prometheus suggests what we've long known, that the world, again, as I've said over and over again, and you know, is made safer by dangerous technologies. It's made safer by new drugs, by radiation, by fire, by new technology. It's even made safer by toothpicks. And it will be made safer still by our realization that the main risk we face today is our excessive reliance on political risk regulation. For beneath the appealing guise of agencies intent on helping us is a process that can truly hurt us by draining our resources, our spirit, our freedoms, and indeed our lives as well. Regulating ourselves into poverty is tragic. To also produce a less safe world is even more tragic. Yet this is a tendency we face today when we politicize risk issues. America is now engaged in an almost constitutional debate with itself over how we get ourselves out of this mess we've got, how we disarm the regulatory leviathan that is doing so much to curb our freedoms, to restrict our abilities to help ourselves make the world a better place. I think most of you by now will realize where I come down on that debate, and knowing you in this audience, I think it's pretty obvious where you do. But we have a tremendous amount of work to do. The American people right now are willing to change. The metal of America is molten. It's ready to be poured into a new mold. That mold can be a revalidation of the regulatory state, of the state of society, the collectivism we've known over the last 100 years. It can be a mode of individual and economic freedom. I think the challenge of us is to make sure that when the metal cools in America's constitutional debate, we're living in a vastly freer world, a world without chains. Thank you.
A friend of mine mind sort of stumped me with a question a few weeks ago. Let's say you have a dry cleaner that puts some stuff into the local atmosphere that is fairly innocuous. In concentrated dose, that could be dangerous to folks, but it's just one dry cleaner. But then you have a small community or a bigger, growing community, and you have suddenly a dozen dry cleaners that are pouring the stuff into the atmosphere. It turns out that, people are getting sick or perhaps dying or whatever from this, having ill effects of some sort from these chemicals. And one dry cleaner could say to himself, this is not good. I'm gonna change. Well,
sure.
You can't do it.
This is a mini problem, Ms. Cobb. Yeah.
Can you give a non-governmental, non-regulatory?
Sure. It happens all the time. This is what's called let me explain. CI is involved in, as I mentioned, a lot of issues. One of them is environmental work. I've got some brochures and cards, and I hope many of you get involved with our organization. We just did a book called The True State of the Planet, which begins to look at what is really happening to the quality of the earth we live on, and also what are some of the things that works. And the problem of the world today is not that there are, the terrible twos problem. There are too many of us, we consume too much, and we rely too much on technology that we understand too little. And the solution, of course, is poverty, ignorance, and death, I guess. Yeah. The real solution is that in America, the problems we face are not problems of that there are too many people or that we're consuming too much, but that we've left too much of our resources in the hands of political or no one to manage. And the airsheds of America are the classic example of that. If you think about us compared to our grandparents, what kind of airsheds, air spaces, do we generally occupy? We are living almost totally, compared to our grandparents, in private airsheds. We live in our privately maintained homes, which are air conditioned in many, many ways. We clean our air, we filter our air, we scent our air, we dry our air, we heat it, we cool it, we humidify it, we do all kinds of things to our air. And then we get in our cars, which are in many ways doing the same thing, and then we drive to our offices, which have the same kind of thing. We shop in malls. In most of the places there's an air management problem. Think of a mall, for example. I mean, after all, malls now could have 100,000 people in them. They have, as you point out, many small establishments, a pizza parlor here, a Roy Rogers there. Those can be quite odoriferous products. In fact, if you're hungry, they can be very pleasant odorific products. But in fact, they can interfere with other activities in the same mall. If you're selling perfumes or fine fabrics, the last thing you want to smell as you're picking up this perfume is, McDonald's French fries. No, it's not what you want to say. What mall managers do, if you've noticed intuitively, is they tend to congregate activities that would have negative consequences with respect to other activities in one part. You put food courts in, for example. You have airflow patterns that suck air from areas towards areas that are likely to be more contaminated. You pay higher bills. If you're a big user, if you're a food store, you're going to be using more air than if you're a clothing store. And your electricity bill will reflect that, the higher cost you'll be paying for air filtration and so on. In better words, we handle the many problem, the many small problems affecting many people a little bit, by essentially integrating the management of the airshed. The mall manager decides for the customers in the mall what kind of airshed to maintain, and then take steps banning certain. You don't find industrial users in malls, because an industrial user would be so incompatible with the other purposes of a mall that it wouldn't be sensible to put them there. You tend to create segregation of activities, processing of activities, and design and standards privately that basically ensure that the mall maintains the air quality that that mall manager wants. Now, there are different kinds of malls. Discount malls may not even be air conditioned. You find that the manager of the mall acts as a private airshed manager for the thousands of people that operate it. One of the things we've proposed is that city governments begin to be thinking of themselves as the airshed managers for their local community, and they make the decisions as to what, if any, uses will be made of their airsheds. If city governments want to become pedestrian areas, then ban all cars in their area. You'll get a cleaner city that not many people will be living in. But that's your decision. You make those kind of choices. Part of what we've got to do is to recognize that trees can't have standing in that environmental paradigm you've heard about, some of you have heard about. But behind trees and aquifers and rivers and lakes and airsheds can stand owner groups, stewardship groups, who by managing their resource creatively, more intelligently, can begin to manage it more intelligently for the rest of us. Some cities will have some dirty air, some cities will have pristine air, and a lot of it would be in the middle. But more importantly, technologies will emerge and improve that allow us to track whose pollutants are causing which problems where, and new technologies will emerge to allow lesser emissions of those products that are causing more problems, or controlled flows of those products. But there's a tremendous amount of work to take those concepts into practical applications. One of the tragedies is we've been for the last 30 years in a collectivist socialist approach to environmentalism, eco-socialism. We aren't doing a very good job at it, but we've spent almost no time thinking about how we would privately manage these resources. Where we have, the resources are vastly better, and that's the theme of our book. But I could talk to you more about the details of that afterwards.
Number one, what's your phone number? And number two, more practically, what would you do with the dry cleaning plant?
I would basically tell the dry cleaners, like other parts in the city would make a decision as to what kind of air it wanted and whether it wanted any dry cleaning establishments in the city. The city or the airshed manager. What does a watershed manager do? You know, we think about a watershed managers. Watershed managers have to decide. They're the people who control the land the water drains into the city reservoirs. They have to decide, do they allow a stable on that area? They might. On the other hand, the stable might contaminate the reservoir. They may allow swimming in the reservoir, some contamination, but maybe not enough to cause a real problem. In the real world, there are risks of denying all uses of an activity, and there are risks of allowing any of them. And what you want to do is to have airshed managers decide, is the banning or the regulating of that activity worth it? It may be. It may be that there should be no dry cleaning establishments in LA, for example. It's almost certainly the case that dry cleaning establishments create no problem at all in 90% of American cities.
So what you're going is for local control.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, sure.
And your phone number again?
202-331-1010. We're in Washington, D.C., but don't hold that as against us. If you're going to be cleaning out the Augean stables, you've got to be where the manure is. So.
I guess what I just heard you say was that we take this problem of the individual dry cleaners and turn it over to a regulatory agency.
A local manager of resource. I mean, regulation, like planning, is something we all do. We regulate our behavior. We walk down the street, somebody does something stupid, we get furious for a moment, we think, I'm going to bash this guy, and we immediately say, wait a minute, that's not very smart. We regulate our behavior. We plan our futures. It's not regulation and planning we're against. It's coercive political planning and coercive political regulation. Regulations are a critical part of every activity in our life. I don't know what what's your profession? Engineer. Well, engineers regulate consistently. They decide what kind of vehicles will ride on bridges, what kind of design, what kind of usage could be made of different equipment. You don't allow, M1 tanks to be carried up in passenger elevators and so on. Regulation is just a common sense approach to making sure you do things sensibly. It's not regulations we're opposed to. It's politically coercive regulations, top-down, government-imposed. Yes, of course we're in favor of regulation, but private regulations.
Your recommendation to the man with the dry cleaning problem would be turn it over to the regulating body.
I said city governments, but I think most of you know, city governments is a proxy for local control, and that undoubtedly will be an intermediate step in many situations. But one of the fastest growing parts of American communities today is not governmental entities, but private planned communities, condominium associations and so on, which are governments in a sense, but they're private governments that you contractually agree to join. And if you notice, condominium associations today have largely taken over gated communities. I'm sure the government means well about keeping us safe and all, but there are people out there who think they're safer when they control the police, and therefore they hire the guards, they build the walls around. Good fences make good neighbors, and a lot of people have decided they'd rather be in private communities where the roads, the security, the utilities are all handled privately. Extending that to the airsheds is just one more, not easy, but imaginative and creative step.
There is another approach to that, and that is that if you turn that over to private industry and you allow the idea to exist that these chemicals are dangerous in the dry cleaning industry, the private industry will find some other solution, and I assure you, my wife will take her cleaners to the new one that's just advertised they have
Sure.
a clean one. It will take care of itself.
Sure, part of it is, and remember there's a risk there as well as a benefit. I mean, recycling is a classic example, and there's nothing wrong with the recycling. You shouldn't apologize for recycling. But of course, recycling has become not a way of ensuring a cleaner environment, but a form of religion. In America, we don't go to church quite as much as our grandparents did, but we religiously attend our recycling centers where we make our offerings of discarded newspapers, bottles and cans, and that most sinful of all products, plastic, hoping that in so doing we expiate for our evil consumptive ways. This is kind of silly. Turning these things into religion, I think, is a danger here. And to a large extent, the risk in America has been that we've taken commonsensical ideas. I live next door to you and I don't like the smell. That's sensible. And then you and I as neighbors have to fight it out. What the transformation of that into a global crusade against radiation, chlorine and so on is a silliness in this area.
The purpose of your institute is to bring this information to the public and publish your books, or do you do something?
We're more active. There are think tanks and there are advocacy groups, and we sort of bridge the gap between the world of intellectual ammunition creation. We do some of that. Our books do that. But at the same time, other groups are doing that, think tanks. We try to bring it into the practice. We engage in regulatory interventions. As APS does, we litigate. We are active in building coalitions. We work with congressional staff to try to improve the prospects for reform ideas. In a sense, think tanks create intellectual ammunition. We're more of a battle tank. We try to fire it in the wars, in the policy wars, or to get into Peter's sexual analogies. We not only write sex manuals, we try to recognize that that's not enough. You've also got to be more active if you're going to have intellectual children. And so we're actually involved in the sort of the messiness of political change in Washington. We're very much of an action-oriented group, and we were involved up to our necks in the risk reform debate with Senator Dole and Graham and all those people.
For $30 a year, you can publish 1 megabyte of material to the world on the internet web. Do you have a website?
We have a website. This is one of those things that all think tank groups, all advocacy groups are frustrated about right now. The web, as those of you know, is changing minute by minute. A year and a half ago, CEI was a leader in this area. Now we're one of the technological laggards in the area. Part of it is we're looking, if any of you have a son or a daughter or a nephew or something who's a computer geek, libertarian, classical, liberal-oriented, and is one of these people who says, oh, that's what you want to do. Well, you turn here and you do this kind of stuff. We're looking for ways of expanding our web presence. We're trying to decide which way to do it. We're also looking at interactive CD-ROM ideas. We're doing television for the first time. We're doing a televised version of those of you know Michael Fimento's book, Science Under Siege, which is applied epidemiology. We're trying to do that. That'll be sort of a conventional television thing. But interactive CDs are one way. You know, the idea of having a CD you can have that allows you to have a quick run-through, if you want to surface one, but allows through hypertexting you to move to video or to extended discussions of the more complex policy processes if you want to, and also cross-references, other action groups is another. And then putting all that on the web. But this is, those of you in this thing is changing so fast that it's clear it has opportunities. But most people I've worked with in this area still don't know what the hell they're doing, including us. But we've been talking to people like in Microsoft about the possibility of being part of Microsoft's engagement in this activity and seeing whether we can be one of the policy groups on the web. But one of the risks is, are we prepared to handle 1,000 queries a day? We're not right now. So one of the dangers is you might be successful in this area too, because we haven't really figured out a way of economically linking, you know, paying. The web hasn't really figured out how to pay for itself yet either. But it's a fun area. I mean, I'm sure I'm the person in the organization. Since I head it, I can decide these things. The good thing about creating your own organization is you can call yourself whatever the hell you want to. I've called myself president, but one of my friends decided to call himself Generalissimo. He thought it sounded more authoritarian. But we're basically trying to figure out how to utilize the capabilities of the web, because if those of you who have cruised the web know that compared to what you read in the newspapers, it's much more classical liberal, classical liberal, libertarian, free market, conservative group. And it's a vibrant source of information. I'm excited about it. I think it's got promise. More questions out there now? Let me say that the way we're going now in this area is, and your groups are important in this, America, I think, is sort of where you guys were probably 10 or 15 years ago. Aware that the promise of the status promises that the last 100 years have experimented with, and in a sense we are at the end of a 100-year period. We tend to think of the New Deal, but the intellectual roots of the New Deal were laid in the late 19th century as American intellectuals went to Europe and came back infatuated with the fact that in Germany intellectuals had respect. The bureaucrats decided the best way of doing things for the others. America tried that. In a way, the West is a classic example. Most of the lands in the West were government lands. And you had different philosophies as to how to utilize those lands for the good of us all. How do we use our lands for our good? Collectivist ideas from beginning to end. You had John Muir, who thought the land should be preserved as beautiful aesthetic amenities for the future generations. And you had Gifford Pinchot, who believed the land should be used as productive economic resources to build homes and jobs for America. They're both values that most of us have in our mind, but in the political process, one value or the other prevailed from time to time. We have Jim Watt, we have Bruce Babbitt. I mean, in a sense, this bang-bang controls theory where either you locked up everything or you exploited everything, and very little reason to think of compromise or mixed use. And in effect, what we had is a very conflicting situation, the spotted owl being sort of the natural ending result of that. We're now in a world where Americans are thinking through, is politics the best way to handling this? Most of us now, remember the folk song that we all heard growing up? Who was it? Who was the folk song singer? Guthrie. William Guthrie? Arlo Guthrie. This land is your land. This land is my land. Now, did this man have a title search done? Have you thought about this? I mean, this land is either my land or it's your land, and when we put it in the political process, it's nobody's land. It's essentially whoever happens to win the last set of votes on the issue. It creates incredible instability, and now I think we're realizing after 100 years of trying to make politics work, making collectivism a rational institution, that we better get on with the task that we started out in America of quickly turning over the resources of America to you, to me, to somebody who will make decisions that you and I won't agree with. They may paint their door the wrong color. They may cut their trees down, or they may not cut their trees down. But it's their land, their resources, and they and all of us collectively as individuals will make vastly more creative choices and a much richer range of choices. A diverse world. If we want to preserve biodiversity, we better create a diverse world of human owners to make different choices. Let me leave you one thought, because this, I think, is a major way of thinking about this. Many of you are religious, many of you have values, and I think you're aware that the eco-theocrats do too. It irritates us. It's not always our religion. But I think we need a certain concept of tolerance within the framework of tolerance that Americans have all known. Our tolerance is not that we have to be, I'm raised Catholic, I don't have to think my Protestant friends' theology is right, but I do have to think they have a right to have that theology. The argument is in America on religion, though, traditional religions, of separation of church and state. The Mormons can build their temples, the Catholics can build their cathedrals, the Jews can build their synagogues, but they do it on private property with private contributions, with private effort. Today, the cathedrals of God are built that way, but the environmentalists are telling us that the cathedrals of nature have to be built with our money, our resources, and our time. That's wrong. We need to separate church and state across America, and if we do so by privatizing the West, we'll have a society that'll be greener and freer. Thank you.